I wish. I wish I could see us, Sex Pistols guitarist Steve Jones said. Maybe that's what Johnny Rotten meant when he said he wanted more bands like us. He got them, dozens of groups, then hundreds, then thousands that cut their own singles weeks after forming, or if one goes by the sound of some of the sides before forming. Put them out on one-shot labels with names like Raw, Frenzy, and Zero, and sold them at shows, independent record stores, through the mail. Most were never meant for the radio, as if in answer to the repression suffered by the Sex Pistols. Groups like the Cortinas, the Lurkers, Eater, and Slaughter, and the Dogs made music so brutal, haphazard, or obscene that airplay was out of the question. Given the assumption that the normal channels of pop communication were irrelevant, all restrictions on what could go into a record or a performance, on what a record could sound like or what a performance could look like, were forgotten. Males could abjure macho posing or push it to ridiculous extremes. Females could ignore the few roles reserved for women in rock. They could ignore roles altogether. If in wartime only the clandestine press is free, the only great nation with a completely uncensored press today, A.J. Liebling wrote 2 months before D-Day, is France. Then it was the fact that the official pop space was closed to most of punk that allowed punk to create its own space of freedom. Though the best-known bands immediately signed with major record companies, that half dozen meant nothing to the hundreds and thousands in the pop wilderness. They are something like a new pop economy based less on profit than on subsistence. The will to shock, marginal but intense. Public response, a pop economy meant to support not careers but hit-and-run raids on the public peace of mind, began to take shape. People cut records not so much on the off chance that they would hit, but to join in, to say I'm here, or I hate you, or I have a big cock, or I have no cock. Teenagers discovered the thrill of shouting fire in a crowded theater, or even in an empty theater. It was a fad, something to do when you could get your parents' permission to stay out late and change your hairstyle. You didn't tell your parents you had changed your name from Elizabeth Mitchell to Sally Thalidomide. A satire of the times caught the fad as well as anything, matching the heedless typography and illiterate syntax of the fanzines that were spreading the news. X. Tell me, Wolf, how did this whole snuff rock scene start? Wolf Frenzy. Well, like it's difficult to be precise, but I think it was the night the bass player in The Noise offed himself. He was really pissed off because he'd been getting a really good sound out of his equipment, so he jumped off the top of his bass stack, breaking his neck and impaling himself on his tuning pegs. Then there was a really spontaneous reaction from the crowd. X. What sort of reaction? Wolf Frenzy. Well, you know, they all laughed and that. X. What do you think of the so-called disease groups like the Boils, Pus, or Super Discharge, who, rather than killing themselves outright, infect themselves with deadly diseases, and deterred deterior debt get sicker every gig until they die? Frenzy. Well, it depends. It's an interesting concept, and it certainly attracts a hardcore of fans. They don't like to miss a gig because they like to see how the sickness is progressing. Some of them will travel hundreds of miles just to watch a finger fall off somebody, but it really depends on the disease. I mean, someone with rabies is going to do a really high-energy gig with lots of leaping about, whereas a guy with yellow fever's going to be just too laid back, like J.J. Cale. What interests me more is the sounds coming out of Jamaica, you know, like Natty Dead, I-Dub, a snuff, or snuffing in a sound check, that sort of thing. X. What do you think of the news that Andy Williams is reported to be doing a simulated snuff act in his new TV series? Frenzy. It's just pathetic, innit? It's just what you expect from him. But this is one scene they can't package and sell back to the kids who created it because they're all dead. But we're not elitist. We'd dearly love to see some of the really big stars like Rod Stewart and Elton John getting snuffed. X. I think most people would. It was a fad, so people banished the love song, the sleeve of radio stars, songs for swinging lovers, pictured a young couple hanging from a tree. They sang instead about masturbation, jobs, class, cigarettes, traffic lights, fascist dictators, race, the subway. Banishing the love song, people discovered what else there was to sing about. The love song had draped their lives in cheap poetry. Maybe now other matters might poeticize their lives. As faddists, punks played with Adorno's negative dialectics. where every yes turns into a no. They straddled their unstable equations. The mother of Sex Pistols drummer Paul Cook coined the name Johnny Rotten in honor of the singer's green teeth. Singing about advertisements, deodorants, fake identities, supermarkets, an overweight, half-caste teenager with braces on her teeth changed herself from Marion Elliott into polystyrene and called her band X-Ray Specs after the glasses she liked to wear. Anti-art was the start, she roared in her one-note voice. An interviewer asked her what she was about. I like to consume, she said, because if you don't, it consumes you. No one knew what that meant or if polystyrene was good or bad. Irony or embrace, an attack on better living through chemistry, or a claim that Polly liked to wear it. That was punk, a load of old ideas sensationalized into new feelings, almost instantly turned into new cliches, but set forth with such momentum that the whole blew up its equations day by day. For every fake novelty, there was a real one. For every third-hand pose, there was a fourth-hand pose that turned into a real motive. The shock. The shock of punk is no longer in its thuggery, misogyny, racism, homophobia, its yearning for final solutions to questions it barely asked. In Negation's empowerment of every fraud and swindle, the punk stance, Lester Bangs wrote in 1979, is riddled with self-hate, which is always reflexive. And anytime you conclude that life stinks and the human race mostly amounts to a pile of shit, you've got the perfect breeding ground for fascism. There was a time in London in 1977 when Jack the Ripper was the ultimate punk, and everything from thuggery to death camps was part of the moment. Eaters frothing, get raped, seemingly as true as the Buzzcocks' sly equation of shopping and dating and breakdown. All these things briefly legitimized by an eruption affirming itself through the embrace of whatever was officially scorned and stigmatized by society at large. Today, so many years later, the shock of punk is that every good punk record can still sound like the greatest thing you've ever heard. A Boring Life, One Chord Wonders, X-Ray Specs' Oh Bondage Up Yours, the Sex Pistols singles, the Clash's Complete Control, the power in these bits of plastic, the tension between the desire that fuels them and the fatalism waiting to block each beat, the laughter and surprise in the voices, the confidence of the music. All these things are shocking now because in its 2 or 3 minutes, each is absolute. You can't place one record above the other, not while you're listening. Each one is the end of the world, the creation of the world, complete in itself. Every good punk record made in London in 1976 or 77 can convince you that it's the greatest thing you've ever heard, because it can convince you that you never have heard anything else as long as you live. You never have to hear anything else as long as you live. Each record seems to say everything there is to say. For as long as the sound lasts, no other sound, not even a memory of any other music, can penetrate. As John Peel said, it was like the 1950s when surprise after surprise came off the radio, but with a difference. If the singers who made 15,000 doo-wop records were amateurs, the musicians who backed them were professionals. If they had no idea what social facts the records might dissolve, they knew which chords came next. The punks who made records in 77 didn't know what chords came next, and they hurled themselves at social facts. The sense that a social fact could be addressed by a broken chord produced music that changed one's sense of what music could be, and thus changed one's sense of the social fact. It could be destroyed. That was what was new. There was no sense of the end of the world in 1950s rock and roll. There is a feeling in the best punk 45s that what must be said very fast, because the energy required to say what must be said and the will to say it can't be sustained. That energy is going to disappear. That will is going to shatter. The idea will go back in the ground. The audience will get up, put on their coats, and go home. Like its rhythm, the punk voice was always unnatural. Speeded up past personality into anonymity, pinched, reduced, artificial. It called attention to its own artificiality for more than one reason. As a rejection of mainstream pop humanism in favor of resentment and dread. As a reflection of the fear of not being understood. But the voice was unnatural most of all out of its fear of losing the chance to speak. A chance, every good punk singer understood, that was not only certain to vanish, but might not even be deserved. The sense of risk one can hear in punk is a distrust of the punk moment itself. It is the will to say everything cut with the suspicion that to say everything may be worth nothing. No one knew where the chance came from, and no one knew what would come of it, save that it couldn't last. Rock and roll had barely said its name in the 1950s when Danny and the Juniors announced that rock and roll is here to stay. There was no such song in punk. Punk wasn't here to stay. Punk was not an opportunity to exploit, no matter how many commercial plots Malcolm McLaren hatched, no matter how many one-time Sex Pistols fans went on to international new wave fame and success. New wave was a code word not for punk without shock, but for punk without meaning. Punk was not a musical genre. It was a moment in time that took shape as a language anticipating its own destruction, and thus sometimes seeking the statement of what could be said with neither words nor chords. It was not history. It was a chance to create ephemeral events that would serve as judgments on whatever came next. Events that would judge all that followed wanting. That, too, was the meaning of no future.